about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Let's get to the right screen, shall we? Let's get everyone involved in tonight's session. There was Sarah thinking, hang on, wait a minute. I was definitely due to be doing this session. So welcome.
I was starting to panic.
Well, by the way, to start with, welcome to the latest GCSE Sociology live stream. And as you can see, the production values of these sessions are right up there with Netflix and the BBC. But I'm absolutely delighted to be joined again tonight by two of our regular presenters who are becoming quite well known for these fantastic GCSE Sociology sessions. We've got Vicky in the middle and Sarah on the right. Sarah.
Hi.
Well, what an amazing term of sessions. I think if you go back over the archive at tutor2u.net/live, you'll find loads and loads of stuff we've done this term and, of course, earlier in 2021. But tonight we're taking a bit of a twist. It's research methods, a bit of a recap session. Is that right, Vicky, Sarah?
Yep,
a bit of an overview. Fantastic. So usual format, a series of activities. Now, if you're watching live, please do have a go. And if you want to, type your answers into the live chat. But we know hundreds and hundreds of students have been watching every session on replays. So if that's you, welcome to just pause the video, particularly on the more challenging activities. Give yourself a bit more time. Use these as revision on this crucial research methods topic. I think we're good to go. Vicky, Sarah, who's starting tonight?
Yeah, I'll start us off. So It is our last GCSE live stream, isn't it, this week? So
yeah,
we've
for this term.
This time. Finishing off with research methods. We've covered crime and deviance, we've done families, we've done education. So obviously if you've missed those, then please go and have a look at those previous ones. But we're going to kick off our proceedings with some missing vowels. You just need to work out those key terms which you will have come across before. These are all to do with different research methods. So if you can pop your answers into the chat window. So our first one is on the board, on the screen there, and I'm not attempting to pronounce these because these would be far too difficult, but the vowels are completely missing. What is this research method? Let's give you a couple of moments to get your answers down in the chat. Doesn't matter how we spell this one because this one is quite a tricky one to spell. Okay, so what do we think this one might be? So a research method that you will have all come across in your studies. Okay, well done. Some answers coming in. So, Jim, if we can have the correct answer on the screen, it is questionnaires. So we are going to talk about these a bit later on in this session. So if we can have the next one up, please, Jim. Okay, a slightly more tricky one. So this is not a research method. This is something that you have to consider when you are conducting your social research. So have a think about those kind of considerations that you have to make when you are collecting your data. This one does start with R. There are no missing vowels before the letters up on the screen. What do we think this one might be? Okay, just give you a moment to get some guesses into the chat window. If you are watching at home on not watching live, then obviously you can give yourself a little bit more moment. Okay, so Jim, can we have this one up, please? It is reliability. So how easy is it to replicate your study? We're going to talk about this a little bit later. Okay, number 3, please. So this one is missing a vowel from the beginning. Okay, I think this one is quite easy. So this is a research method. So something you might choose to do if you are conducting some social research. Quite a time-consuming method, this one. So what do we think this one might be? I'm just going to give you a couple of moments. If you need to pause for a minute to have a sort of try and work it out, then please do. Okay, Jim, can we have that on the screen? It is interviews. Again, we're going to talk about this one a little bit more later on in the session. So number 4, please. Okay, so again, not a method, but a consideration that you need to think about when you are collecting your data. So we think about the reliability of data, and we think about this word also. So what do we think this one might be? Just give you a moment to get what you think is the correct answer into the chat. Okay, well done. Some good answers coming through there. If we can have that up on the screen, please. It is validity. So how truthful is your research? Okay, and our last one is another type of research method here. So the first letter is missing from this one. So we've done questionnaires, we've mentioned interviews. What method is this one? What do we think? So again, another quite a time-consuming method. Okay, just give you a moment to get that into the chat window. Well done, those of you that have had a guess. So if we can have the correct answer on the screen, please, Jim. It is observation. Again, we're going to talk about all of these key phrases later on in this session. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk about what we are covering today.
Okay, so what are we covering today? We are going to be looking at types of data, which Vicky will kick off with in a moment. The difference between some of those keywords, qualitative, quantitative, primary and secondary being the main focus. We'll then look at methods of collecting data, and we'll be focusing on those core methods of questionnaires, observations and interviews. And then we'll be analysing those practical considerations, some of the terms that came up in the starter just now: representativeness, reliability, validity and ethical considerations. So Vicky is going to kick off with types of data.
Excellent. So when socialists are planning their research, they need to think about what type of data will be most useful to their study. And data can be divided up into 2 groups. So we can have qualitative data and quantitative data. So qualitative data cannot be expressed as a number. It takes the form of words, it might be pictures, it might be observation write-ups, all sorts. Whereas quantitative data can be expressed as a number or can be quantified. So on the screen, we've got an example of that. So it's research data that is in words and is detailed, and it helps us to provide context. This is qualitative data. And we said it's not numerical. It's interesting. It gives you lots of context. Not always easy to make comparisons with those. So Jim, can I have the next slide up, please? So then we have our quantitative data, that numerical data that can be presented in tables and graphs, and it's really easy to measure, it's easy to put in categories, it's easy to put in rank order, and researchers tend to use it to construct graphs and tables of data. And it is really quite, this data can be really quite detailed, so it's quite time consuming to collect, but it is really quite useful. One of the probably most famous examples of quantitative data is the census that gets collected every 10 years in the UK. And so the government send out this big survey, and some of you will be quite aware of this. It takes ages to fill in. It's not overly exciting as a household to fill in, but it does provide lots of really interesting data at the end that the government uses to inform all sorts of policies and whatnot. So when we think about these data, these two types of data, when we're talking about quantity, a good way to remember it is using the first 7 letters of the word quantitative. So it's data that's high in quantity, i.e. there's lots of it, whereas qualitative data tends to be quality data. So it's more detailed, it provides you with context. Okay, Jim, can we have the next one up, please? So as well as thinking about types of data in terms of quantitative or qualitative, we also think about it in terms of whether it's primary data or whether it's secondary data. So they have to think about, when sociologists are collecting their data, they think about where they are going to collect their data, where they're going to get their data from. Will they collect their data, or they use data that's already been collected by other people? So many sociologists will choose to collect their own primary data, and they use secondary data to back up their findings. So primary data is research information that sociologists have collected themselves, and it takes the form of questionnaires, interviews, observations, and we're going to talk about those a bit later. Often referred to as surveys, kind of as a collective term. And they will think really carefully about the most appropriate way to collect their data, and how that, what sort of data is going to be most useful to them. And it tends to be, because it's collected directly, it tends to be quite time consuming and often quite costly to collect, particularly interviews and observations. But it does mean your researcher knows exactly where their information has come from. Then if we think about secondary data, Jim, can we have the next slide up? So this is data that's been collected by someone else for another purpose, and it's often used by those social researchers to back up their own research findings. And there is lots and lots of sources of secondary data. Some of these are quantitative, such as the official stats like the census that I've already mentioned, whereas some will be qualitative. So you might have old diaries, books, newspapers, all sorts of things. The biggest advantage of this data is that it already exists and it's easily available. So it's a really good way of helping you as a sociologist build up a bigger picture. However, because it's been collected by someone else, there are sometimes issues to consider. It might be out of date, for example. I mean, the census is only collected every 10 years. It could be biased. It could simply be completely overwhelming because there is so much of it. Okay, Jim, can we have our first activity up? So we have a melting snowman 20-second challenge. I'm going to show you a question. You have got 20 seconds to answer that question before the snowman melts before your very eyes. So Jim, can we have that question up, please? So our first question is, what is the difference between qualitative and quantitative data? We've just talked about these. Hopefully you were listening. Jim, if we can have the 20-second countdown on, please. Okay, for some reason we haven't got any music, but if you can imagine some sort of Christmas jingles in your head, I'm not going to sing to you because that would be horrific. So our snowman is melting before your very eyes. This is something my daughter watched me put this together the other day and was quite distressed at the puddle of the snowman right at the very bottom. So let's have a look at the answer. So qualitative data is research data that is in words and is detailed, helping to provide context, whereas quantitative data is statistical data that is numerical and can be presented in tables and graphs. And well done. Just notice the answer has come into the chat window. Absolutely excellent answer there. Well done. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk to us about our first research method. Oh, sorry, I hadn't realised that. Sorry, I didn't realise that there was another 20-second challenge coming up. I'm just getting ahead of myself. So what is primary data? Can you give me 3 examples? So again, can we have the 20-second timer on? Okay. I'm really sorry. I had completely forgotten that I'd put that next question in. Okay, so primary data, 3 examples. Now, if you were listening at the beginning, particularly Sarah talking through what we were going to cover, and me in the missing vowels, we did talk about these. So, Jim, can we have the answers on the screen, please? So, it's data that's been collected by yourself, such as questionnaires, interviews, and observations. Okay, can we have the next slide? Excellent. So, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah now.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm glad we didn't miss a chance to melt that second snowman there.
Oh, it's just so sad.
We are going to have a look at questionnaires. So we're going to focus in on questionnaires, and then after that, we're going to look at observations. So questionnaires are basically a series of questions used by sociologists to find out more about the issue that is their research focus. They're one of the most widely used methods, and you'll see in a moment, we'll look at the advantages and why they're so widely used. Questionnaires, one of the advantages is that questionnaires tend to generate large amounts of quantitative, so that lovely numerical data. So, for example, the UK census, because it's in a questionnaire format, very, very large sample, so large amounts of data that can be quantified. Thanks, Jim. So questionnaires tend to be made of open or closed questions, most commonly a combination of the two. So most researchers would choose a combination of open and closed questions so that they can gather those different types of information. So the open questions are really beneficial because they allow the respondent to develop their answers in more detail. So they're able to speak, the respondent can speak in their own words rather than simply ticking a box or using a multiple choice aspect in a questionnaire. However, the closed questions, the ones where you are limited to a specific response, it might be a yes, no, it might be a sliding scale, it might be choose from some different options. They give the respondent less opportunity to be flexible with their answer, but they are much easier to quantify. So there's some real benefits to those closed questions. Next slide, please, Jim. Thank you. So it's really important for your GCSE that you are able to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of the methods, as well as being able to identify the features and the advantages of those methods. So some of the strengths that it's important to identify is the fact that you can standardise the questions. Now, this increases the reliability of using this method because the same questions are being asked to every respondent. Questionnaires are quick and cheap, particularly with the way we can kind of spread those through social media these days. We can use electronic questionnaires. There are loads of real benefits to being able to get them out there nice and easily without having to pay a huge amount of money. And it's not just quick and cheap to put them out there, but quick and cheap to analyze as well, because there are so many technology platforms now that will do the analysis for you. We've talked already about a large sample size. That's a huge strength of questionnaires, that we can reach a very big sample size. And because of the technology, that could be a global sample size as well. And another benefit of questionnaires is that they can be anonymous. So it's easy to keep a questionnaire anonymous and to kind of keep that aspect of anonymity, which may increase the validity of your responses because people may feel as though they can speak freely with no repercussions. So the weaknesses are equally important for you to analyse and evaluate questionnaires. So one of the weaknesses of questionnaires is interpreting the questions. If you have received something online or you've received a paper-based questionnaire, it's down to your interpretation of the question. So the way you interpret the question may not be the way that the researcher meant it. Therefore, it will lack validity because your answer may not be responding, to what the researcher thinks it's responding to. Response rate is another factor for the weaknesses of questionnaires. There have been some very famous examples where sociologists have sent out thousands of questionnaires, and there's been a very, very high dropout rate of people who haven't responded, or we would call that also a very low response rate. And if you get a low response rate, then it starts to, not only have you got a smaller sample size, but it starts to ask lots of questions about whether you've got a representative sample there at all, because there may be certain types of people who have chosen not to respond. Lack of detail, particularly with those closed questions, often particularly certain types of sociologists would argue that the lack of detail really reduces the validity of using questionnaires. And there's also this possibility of questioner bias. So many sociologists would argue that the researcher writing the questionnaire may put across their own bias in the possible options that they give you for your answers, but also in the way the questions are written. So there could still be leading questions, and there could be a bias which therefore affects the validity of your questionnaire. So there's questionnaires, and Vicky is going to take us forward with observations.
Excellent, thank you very much. So observation simply just means observing that social life as it happens in its usual setting. And this setting could be the classroom, in the local park, in the town centre, in a workplace, all sorts of places. It is a really, really useful method as a researcher is watching people in their real life setting. So they get to observe all sorts of natural behaviours and interactions, and that increases the validity of the research study that they are taking part in. Okay, Jim, can we have the next slide up, please? So once a sociologist has decided that they want to use observation to conduct their piece of research, they've got to decide how they're going to conduct their observation. And there are 4 different types of observation that you can see up on the screen in front of you. So observers have to make 2 decisions. Firstly, they have to decide whether they're going to tell their subjects whether they are being observed or not. So this is covert or overt observation, which I'll talk to you about in a bit more detail in a moment. And secondly, they have to decide whether they're going to join in with their subjects and whether they are using participant or non-participant observation. So let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. So firstly, sorry, Jim, can you go back to that previous one? Thank you. So firstly, the observer needs to decide whether to tell people they're being observed that this is happening. And if they choose to use overt observation, it means the participants know that the study is happening, that they are being observed, and the researcher has been honest about what they're doing. So this is quite good ethically. However, knowing they are being observed can lead people to change their behaviour slightly. So some of you will have come across a Hawthorne effect, which comes from an experiment conducted in 1930 Chicago that looked at factory workers and how they might become more productive. They did all sorts of things in the natural environment in that factory to see whether it actually increased their productivity. But what they did notice at the end of the study is the one thing that did change behaviour was just the fact that they were simply being watched. So therefore, it's not overly reliable if people are changing their behaviour. Or you can use covert observations, which means that you observe your subjects without their knowledge or their permission, obviously. And the reason that lots of sociologists like this is because it means that they're much more likely to behave naturally. The study's going to have increased validity. And it is also one of the only ways sociologists can study areas of interest, such as criminal activity. Okay, so that's quite an interesting choice that they have to make. Then they have to make that choice about whether they're joining in or not. So if a researcher chooses participant observation, they will interact with the subjects that they're studying. They might become a member of a group, for example. They'll mirror their behaviour. But this does mean that your presence and actions as a sociologist could actually affect the group behaviour. It also relies on memory, obviously, because when you're actually joining in, you can't very well sort of stand there with your notepad noting everything down. So you have to make your notes afterwards. So again, they might not be overly reliable. With non-participant observation, you kind of watch from a sort of, you observe your subjects from a distance. So there's no interference. You're not going to affect behaviour at all. So, for example, like doing a classroom observation from the back of the room, but not moving around to talk to members of the class. So during this one is a bit easier for the sort of making notes, producing tally charts, etc. But they can be sort of non-participant or participant observation can be overt or covert. So I'm going to, so like Sarah said, you need to know about the pros and cons of your data collection type. So Jim, if we can just have the next slide up. So observation has lots of strengths and weaknesses. The first strength is you're observing subjects in the natural setting. So you get a better understanding of that issue at hand, and it does give your study much more validity, which is obviously a really, really good thing. You also get to carry out, because you're watching something, you're getting like a really good in-depth detailed sort of knowledge of what's going on with that group of people. It's first-hand data collection, so you know that you can trust it, and it is really good for hard-to-reach groups that perhaps might refuse to engage with other forms of primary data collection. But it does have lots of weaknesses as a method of data collection. So it can cause a big time commitment. If you're doing some sort of participant observation study, this might last months, perhaps even years. So one of the reasons for this is that you have to spend a significant amount of time building up relationships in the first place to reach those hard to access groups. And you have to be really patient once you're doing so. And because of this, it tends to have a really small sample size, which is down to that sort of practical idea of studying those larger groups. But therefore it does mean that that sample size might actually be too small to be representative. We've already mentioned that it's quite difficult in terms of note taking. And you also have that idea of those ethical considerations, which we have with all types of data collection. So you need to really think about, as a sociologist, whether you are comfortable with participants who might be unaware that they're being studied, and you might actually end up putting yourself in danger or sort of engaging in criminal behaviour as part of a participant observation study. So there's all sorts of things to consider. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who's going to talk to you about interviews.
Thanks, Vicky. So we're going to have a look at interviews, and then we've got a lovely festive activity coming up to test your knowledge of these collection methods we've looked at. So an interview is essentially a conversation. The interviewer will ask, or the sociologist will ask questions, and the respondent will provide replies. That's it in its simplest form, but interviews do come in several different formats. Firstly, they could be in person, they could be online, like we're doing now through a video link, they could be over the phone. They could also be with individuals, or they could be with a group of people. And however their format is, the interviewer has to have some way of recording the data that they are gathering. So they might take notes during the interview, and of course that can have its own implications. They could type notes during the interview, or they could record electronically so that they go away with a file that then needs transcribing. And next slide, please, Jim. Thank you very much. So here's a bit more about types of interviews. So we've got structured, unstructured, and semi-structured, and then we'll look at focus groups. So a structured interview would have a very standardized list of questions. Structured interviews are almost like a spoken questionnaire. They would use the same questions for every different respondent who was interviewed. Whereas an unstructured interview would be very, very flexible. So we might refer to that as more of a narrative interview, where people are able to speak freely, where the interviewer steps back and kind of listens to the interviewee. However, this is very hard to replicate, not like the structured interview where we're replicating the same questions. These unstructured narrative interviews can be very difficult to then draw a comparison between respondents. And then in the middle, we've got the semi-structured interview. So we've got some quite famous studies you'll look at in your lessons of sociologists who've used semi-structured interviews. And these will follow a framework of topics, or they may have some set standard questions, but they may use follow-up questions in between those. This is widely used because of the flexibility that it gives you. It's kind of the best of both worlds between the structured and the unstructured interview. Finally, we've got our focus group. And focus groups are a group interview, really, and you'll have a small group of people, probably quite a diverse group, so that you've got a representative sample there. And this is an opportunity to ask the group to respond to certain stimuli. So those stimuli might be questions, but they might be images. They could be, opinion-based questions as well. Next slide, please, Jim. Thank you very much. So when we write about interviews, when we're analysing interviews in these assessments and exams, we need to be really aware that there is a relationship taking place in the interview, and that relationship can really build or take away from the kind of results that the sociologist can gather. So interviews can often be very personal, and we do talk about the connection between the interviewer and the respondents. We've got this idea of trust and rapport. So you'll probably look in your lessons at sociologists like Anne Oakley, who are very famous for building up an amazing rapport and trust between themselves and the people that their respondents who they were interviewing. And this is argued by many sociologists to be vital when conducting interviews, and it increases that validity because the people you're speaking to are more likely not just to open up, but to be honest about their feelings, and therefore the data you're gathering is far more valid. But the flip side of the coin is interviewer bias. So the interviewer's personal characteristics or their own kind of position, their own theoretical position, may influence the respondent to answer in a particular way. And we're kind of thinking of things like social desirability there, but also with the researcher effect on the respondent. So, for example, if the interviewer is a feminist, they might accidentally kind of ask leading questions. Or if we think about, there's something called demand characteristics, where the respondent starts to pick up on what they think the interviewer wants, and that kind of leads their responses as well. So we've got kind of two sides there. So you look at your real advantage, disadvantages of interviews, or things to be careful of. Next slide, please. So overall, strengths and weaknesses of interviews. And again, as Vicky said, really important that you know the strengths and weaknesses so you can really analyse each method, depending which one comes up in the questions you're given. So the strengths of interviews are that it is primary data. It's collecting people's views firsthand. Therefore, you can ask specific questions. You're getting the data that you want. They are flexible, especially those semi-structured interviews, very flexible. So the researcher is able to ask follow-up questions or make changes and judge things like body language as well. They allow for more in-depth answers. So if we compare them to questionnaires, interviews do allow for more in-depth gathering of information. And also, there is a higher level of validity because with interviews, we're able to build that level of trust and we're able to create that relationship with somebody. So therefore, we would presume that they may be more honest than they would be with something that's kind of anonymous and more throwaway and more distant, like a questionnaire. The weaknesses, though, of interviews are they can be incredibly time consuming, particularly if they are individual interviews. The researcher has got to carry out their interview for each of the individuals that they want to speak to. Not only the time commitment of carrying out the interviews, but they've also got to transcribe, write up and analyse all of the data. So this can be a huge time commitment. Dobash and Dobash, some of their interviews went on for over 12 hours. I mean, that's quite rare, but it gives an idea of the magnitude of how time-consuming interviews can be. There's also the aspect we talked about of interviewer bias, so having to be careful of our own positionality as interviewers. And of course, if we're not using a highly structured interview, they can be very difficult to replicate. And therefore, some sociologists will really take issue with that idea that we're not using something that's standardized. And then that brings us to the aspect of reliability. If we're not using a standardized interview, if it's very difficult to replicate, then are we producing a reliable set of data? Okay, so well done. You've just taken on lots of information there about 3 different data collection methods. Let's have a go at some retrieval so we can use some of that lovely new information. Right, we're going to do a Rudolph's odd one out, very festive. You're going to see 4 items on the screen, and then you can pop A, B, C, or D into the comments so that we know which you think is the odd one out. And if you would like to give a reason or you'd like to say what connects the other 3, then please feel free to do that as well. So I'll give you a moment there to have a think. We've got Hawthorne effect, covert, overt, and non-participant. Can you observe which is the odd one out there? Okay, let's have a look at the answer, please, Jim. Thank you very much. The Hawthorne effect was the odd one out. Well done to those of you that got that right. The other 3 were linked together by being types of observations, whereas the Hawthorne effect is a consideration of observations. I think we're ready for the next one. Thank you very much. So which of these 4 items do you think is the odd one out and why? What connects the other 3? So we've got observe in natural settings, changes to behaviour, high level of detail, and good for hard to reach groups. What could be the odd one out there? We've got some suggestions coming through in the comments. We've got B being suggested as the most popular at the moment. Let's have a look at that answer, please, Jim. Well done to those of you who got that right. Well done, Minecraft. Good to see you back again. Changes to behaviour. So the others were strengths of observations, but changes to behaviour could be a disadvantage or at least a consideration of observations. Let's have a look at the next one, please. So which one is the odd one out here? We have got changes to working environment, time consuming, Chicago factory workers, and observations change behaviour. Which one of those do you think is the odd one out? And what do you think connects the others? Okay, let's have a look at the right answer there, please. Time consuming. So the other three are all related to that Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is a brilliant concept to bring into your answers to show that you really understand the possible limitations of observing your participants. And that connects all the others, but the aspect it's time consuming is true with observations, but not related to the Hawthorne effect. So time consuming is a practical issue, but the Hawthorne effect is a validity issue. So well done to those of you that got that right. And we've got our fourth and final Rudolph's odd one out to look at here before we move on to looking at some more considerations. We've got first-hand data collection, small sample size, time-consuming, and hard to take accurate notes. Which is the odd one out there, and what links the other three? Give you a moment to pop your answers in the chat. Okay, well done. Let's have a look at the correct answer there. First-hand data collection. So the other three were weaknesses of observations, whereas it being first-hand data collection is a benefit really of observations because you're able to see for yourself. Brilliant. Well done for everyone who responded there. And I'm going to hand back over to Vicky to look at some more considerations.
Excellent. So once you've decided which of those methods you're going to have to use, that you want to use, then you have to think about whether your research meets three criteria to show whether it's actually useful or not. So firstly, you've got to decide whether your research is representative of the target population. So does it actually include the actual group of people that you want to find out about? And is your sample size big enough? For example, you might be looking at the experience of Syrian refugees in the UK. So your sample would probably need to exclude other migrant groups, but actually contain a large amount of Syrian migrants to ensure that experiences were commonplace and not just localized. Secondly, you need to think about whether your research is reliable. Could it be repeated in a different time and a place and still produce similar results? And can that data produced in your survey be trusted? And finally, in order to make your research useful, it needs to be valid. So does it actually answer what you set out to do? Is the data you collected relevant to the overall question? If a research study doesn't fit these three criteria, then it's not actually going to be as useful as you might like. So let's have a think about some of these other practical considerations. Jim, can we have the next slide up? Thank you. So there are lots of practical issues around primary data collection. It's really important that you also consider those ethical issues as well when you conduct a piece of research. So firstly, there is the issue of consent, and in particular, that informed consent. It's about the participants being fully aware of what the study involves and what the information they provide will be used for. Participants also have the right to withdraw their consent at any time during that research process, which of course can be a complete and utter nightmare for the researcher if that does happen. Some participants might not be able to give their own informed consent. For example, if you were doing a study into young children or perhaps vulnerable adults, so they would need to have a guardian to give consent on their behalf, and obviously they would also need to know exactly what that was being used for. So secondly, our research needs to think about whether you can guarantee that the participants can remain anonymous within your study. This is really important when you're talking to vulnerable groups of people, but it's also really likely to generate more honest opinions if the participants feel they're not going to get in trouble for talking to a researcher. For example, they might be worried they might lose their job. Thirdly, there's the issue of morality. So a really good example of this, and it's a study that you might have come across in your GCSE, is James Patrick's Glasgow gang study from the 1960s. So a really classic old study. So he gained the trust of gang members through deception. It was a covert participant observation study where he pretended to be a gang member, but as a result he had to stand by and watch teenage gang members commit crimes and take drugs and do all sorts of things, which lots of people would argue was really morally questionable. And then obviously linked to that is the possibility that the participants may be harmed in the research process. So Sarah mentioned earlier Dobash and Dobash's classic study where they interviewed women. It was like a study into domestic violence. Those respondents obviously had to recount their experiences, which would have been really, really traumatic for them. So it's one of those you have to really consider these ethical considerations, because the last thing you want to do is cause harm to people that are taking part in your study. So we're going to do a connection wall thinking about these these practical and ethical considerations. So as usual, 16 key phrases grouped into 4 groups of 4. So the first connection I would like you to look for are those that are to do with representativeness. So as we normally do, if you can put the letters and the numbers into the chat window, if you're watching this not live, this would be a really good time to pause and give yourself a little bit more time, because the connection wall is always a little bit tight for time when we're doing it live. So which are to do with representativeness? So the idea of, your sample size, your target population perhaps would be involved here. What do we think? I'm going to give you a few moments to try and get what you think are the correct answers into the chat. Okay, and if you are watching on replay, then you need to just give yourself a pause, give yourself a little bit more time. Okay, so these are all to do with sort of sampling and the people that you want to speak to. So Jim, can we have the correct answers up on the screen? So is the sample typical of the target population? Do the results overgeneralise the issue? Sampling method and target population mentioned there as well. Excellent. Well done for those of you that got those correct. Okay, our second group of 4 are to do with validity. So how truthful, how close to the truth has your study got? So again, I'll give you a few moments. If you can pop your answers into the chat window. Again, watching not live, then give yourself a pause, give yourself a little bit more time. So validity we're looking for this time. Okay, so I'll give you a few more moments to get some of these down into that chat window. Okay, if you are watching on catch up, you might want to pause the video now. Jim, can we have the correct answers up on the screen, please? Well done for those of you who got some answers in there and got the right answers. So we've got trust rapport, that's more likely to generate honest answers. Are the answers given honest? How near to the truth of the study how near to the truth of the study got? And observing subjects in their natural environment. That's going to increase the validity too. Okay, our last one is, our next one is looking at reliability. So I'll give you a few moments to get the answers into the chat. We've only got 8 left now that it can be. Okay, so have a look at again, reliability is that idea of, can we repeat it? Is it truthful? Okay, so if you are watching on catch up, if you can pause your video now to give you a little bit more time, because we are about to reveal the answers. Jim, can we have the answers up? Thank you very much. So everyone has asked the same questions, is repeated over and over again to get the same results. The interpretation of questions is really key here. So is everybody interpreting them correctly? And repeated by another researcher would get you the same results. So well done for those of you that got the correct answers there. There's a few good answers coming in that chat window. So our last 4, what connects them? So participants are protected from harm, anonymity throughout that study, the moral code of conduct to follow, and informed consent. What is the connection here? So I'm just going to give you a moment to have a think about what we've just talked about in this section. Well done, Minecraft. It is ethical considerations. Excellent. Some really good answers coming through the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah just to run through a quick bit of exam gold with you. And then I think she's got a Santa's riddle to round us off.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, we're going to have a look at a 4-mark question. So you can see on the screen, we've got an identify and explain question. It's asking for one disadvantage of using unstructured interviews to investigate delinquent behaviour. So there are 2 aspects to the question that we want to respond to here. One is the aspect of unstructured interviews. Using the knowledge we've looked at today, think about what are our limitations and why can unstructured interviews sometimes be problematic. But the other aspect of this question is to link that to using unstructured interviews to investigate delinquent behaviour. Can we have the next slide, please, Jim? So these are some of the answers you might like to think about if you are posed a question like this. You could use the fact that it's time consuming for, to conduct these unstructured interviews. You could think about the fact there would therefore be a smaller sample size because of how time consuming it is. You may also include the fact it's difficult to analyse the responses because an unstructured interview is far less standardised and it's far less kind of repeated and uniform as a structured interview would be. So it's more difficult to kind of spot patterns and compare your responses. And you've also got this aspect of interviewer bias. So if it's unstructured, you can't rely on that uniformity of the questions. So therefore, that bias from the interviewer might creep in even more. And if we can have the next slide, please, we've got some exam goals. So this is your reminder of how to really hit those top mark bands